Despite popular belief to the contrary, entrepreneurship in the United States is dying. It has been since the Great Recession of 2008, and the negative trend in American entrepreneurship has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, unfortunately. New firms are being started at a slower rate, they're employing fewer workers, and they're being formed disproportionately in just a few major cities in the US. And at the same time, large chains are opening more locations. Companies like Amazon, with their deliver everything and anything, are rapidly replacing Main Street businesses. My guests today know a lot about these trends and more. Elizabeth MacBride and Seth Levine are the authors of the new book, The New Builders, Face to Face with the True Future of Business. In the book, they tell the stories of the next generation of entrepreneurs and argue for the future of American entrepreneurship. Let me introduce both and then I'll bring them right on. Elizabeth MacBride is an award-winning business journalist and the founder of Times of Entrepreneurship, a new publication covering entrepreneurs beyond Silicon Valley, which we'll talk about a lot today. I'm not there. Elizabeth has reported on business, economics, and entrepreneurship around the world, from New York City to Gaza to Northern Idaho to Cambodia. So lots of different places. She's a former managing editor of Crain's New York business. Her work has appeared in Forbes, Newsweek, The Washington Post, Quartz, HBR.com, and many others. She's also been an entrepreneur herself as co-founder of RIABiz.com and 200kfreelancer.com. And she was part of the founding team of Wealthfront, the first online investment advisor. Now, her partner in crime is Seth Levine. He's a longtime venture capitalist who works with venture funds and companies around the globe. He's a partner at Foundry Group, a Boulder, Colorado-based venture capital firm he co-founded in 2006, which at the end of 2020 had almost $3 billion in assets under management. Seth also co-founded Pledge 1%, a global network of companies who've pledged to give equity, time, and products back to their local communities. He's on the board of Startup Colorado that promotes entrepreneurship in areas of Colorado outside of the Front Range. He also works with a number of different funds and companies, especially in the Middle East and Africa, to promote entrepreneurship and economic development. Lots of stuff there for both of you guys. Welcome to the Go for Launch podcast, Elizabeth and Seth.
Nice to meet you, Brandon. Thanks for having us.
Good to be here, Brandon. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll ask both of you. My first question is, where are you individually today in the world?
Well, I live in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right outside Washington, D.C.
All right, excellent. My wife lived in Washington a number of years ago. Love the place. And Seth?
I am in Longmont, Colorado, which is the town next door to Boulder, Colorado. It's a little better known.
All right. Excellent. Love Boulder. Such a great place. I just remember when I went there, it was like gorgeous and sunny one minute, raining the next minute. It was just ridiculous, crazy environment. But
we are living that today. There's 7 inches of snow. You can probably see it behind me. And this weekend it will be 75 degrees. So,
all right, go over on YouTube, guys. And if you're listening to the podcast, check out the background behind Seth. Well, I want to find out how you guys met and how this book came about. So let's start there.
Oh, that's such a great question, and not everybody thinks to ask it. So Seth and I met when we were both working in, Seth was not physically there. I was in Jerusalem, and Seth was an investor in some companies in and around Jerusalem. And so I talked to Seth, I think, related to one of those companies, and remembered him and kind of thought, who is this VC, like just investing from Colorado, like out in the world, and remembered him and looked him up when I was in Denver on some business.
Nice. So you guys,
that we should say, Brandon, yeah, that was probably, I mean, that point's actually important. That was probably 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
I had been doing a bunch of work in Palestine, and I think we kind of bonded over this really shared interest in, it turned out we both had interest in the continent of Africa and some different markets there. And we bonded over this shared interest around, call it non-traditional entrepreneurs, or at least entrepreneurs that maybe were a little out of the mainstream. And so that's how we started talking about that over a number of years. And then at one point, Elizabeth was in Boulder. I remember sitting in my office at the time, and we were talking about there are stories of entrepreneurs that maybe are a little bit out of the mold, the typical mold that most people are talking about in mainstream US media, that are US based as well. And maybe we should be telling some of those stories. And so we started talking about that, and that evolved eventually into the idea of writing this book to really highlight their stories, which was originally going to be a little bit more of a lighthearted, sort of vignette into a handful of interesting founders. But when we actually started doing some of the research, and I'm sure we'll get deep into this later in the podcast, but when we started doing the research, what we found alarmed us, and that really kind of accelerated, the timeline for the book, and really accentuated why we felt like it was so important to get these stories out into the wild.
When I started reading the book, it immediately struck me, this is not the typical book about entrepreneurship. Like you said, there are some stories in there about some amazing stuff that happened even in the 19th century that many people don't read about in textbooks. People that were able to scrape together a lot of money at the time, under strange circumstances or difficult circumstances. Like one woman I remember you described was a former slave who built a business making dresses and eventually ended up doing that in the White House. So crazy stuff. And so I really want to talk about the where you sort of crack open the egg early on, that there are a lot of these big misconceptions about who entrepreneurs are and what they look like. And they're not all rich white guys with trust funds or Ivy League degrees. So can you tell us what the true picture of entrepreneurs looks like today in America?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Big question to start with.
We're both excited to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, so we call them the new builders. And the people that are the true picture of entrepreneurship in America, and the real vision of who an entrepreneur is, just ought to be a lot broader than the perception that's in the mainstream media. Because what we found in our research is that it's increasingly women and people of color. They're starting businesses at much faster rates than white men are. The bulk of entrepreneurs are not the high-tech entrepreneurs. Those are really a few 100,000 of the total, which is somewhere between 20 and 24 million small businesses in America. And then many of them, and the most successful ones, are older than the stereotype. So the stats bear that out, that the most successful founders tend to be in their mid-40s. And I think that number is going up as the demographic ages.
And I think, Brandon, I'd say more broadly, there are a handful of key themes that we touch on in the book. And you actually described at least the start of some of them in your intro, but it's important to kind of lay them out, I think, for listeners. Specifically, entrepreneurship in the United States is declining, right? And most people don't realize that because they read about entrepreneurs everywhere. But actually, if you look at the statistics, it's been relatively flat over the last 20 years. Kauffman Foundation has great research on this. And it's been negative for the first time in a handful of years. We obviously don't know what's happened during COVID. We know a lot of businesses shut down. We also know there was a spike in applications for new business licenses. So it might be another year or two before we've kind of figured that out. But overall, in the last 20 years, entrepreneurship has been declining. We believe that the definition of entrepreneurship has been overtaken by Silicon Valley in a way that is kind of dangerous and is contributing to our fundamental misunderstanding of new businesses and, frankly, who is starting those new businesses. We talk a lot in the book about this obsession with size that we have now in the United States, and how toxic that is, and frankly, just how out of balance that is. This is not a book that is big is bad, small is good, but we talk about sort of why there needs to be a balance in our country, and how we're getting out of balance. And then we talk a lot about what Elizabeth mentioned, which is just that the people that are starting businesses today are different from the people that have started businesses in the past, and frankly are different than most people realize. And specifically that new business owners are much more likely to be women and Black and brown. And many, as Elizabeth mentioned, are older than they realize. I think those are kind of the key themes, all of which lead to this challenge where we've kind of got this dissociation between how we're financing companies and who's starting those businesses. And I think that's really kind of the crux of what we argue for in the New Builders, which is a new way of thinking about how to channel money and resources to these new builders.
I think it's a challenging and exciting book to read because of all of that. just sort of taking the veneer off of the stereotypes, as you said. And, one of the things that rubs me personally wrong is that divide, like you said, between what are considered startups and regular entrepreneurs, regular small business owners. The startups have capitalize on all the headlines. They're the typically tech startups, like you said, mostly out of Silicon Valley, lots in Colorado, Charlotte, other places, but they get the bulk of the attention. And what sucks to me is that, people consider them the sexy companies, many of which start and they don't make revenue for years. And that as a venture capitalist, and the typical small business owner thinks that is complete BS. That's like, no one would think to go start a hair salon or a restaurant or anything else, small business, cutting grass or whatever, and think, I'm just going to wait it out for months or maybe years and see if I'll make money later. No, most people that want to start a business are thinking profit from day one. So I had a question for you. Beyond those software startups, what role are other small businesses playing in things like saving the wilderness, saving small towns and redline communities?
Yeah, so this was a great pleasure in writing The New Builders. And maybe I'll talk about my favorite story from the book, and maybe Seth can too, because what we uncovered in the research were just such incredible stories of grit and smarts and passion among the small businesses and entrepreneurs that we discovered. The one that I really pressed forward to get into the book is a family-owned business in Montana that is an outfitting business. So they guide people into the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And I really centered the story on the matriarch of the younger generation of the family, whose name is Claire Sheff. And what I discovered when I was doing that reporting is that if it weren't for that group of small businesses, those outfitters, which are really all small family-owned businesses, the wilderness would be in much worse shape, right? They do so much to maintain the trails. They really advocate for the wilderness, and they take people into the wilderness and turn them into advocates who then speak to the broader world. So that's one of the stories in the book about the impact that we found small businesses and that kind of entrepreneur having on their communities.
I love that. And also that strikes me as the classic lifestyle business. And who doesn't think that sounds appealing? Guiding people into the wilderness of Montana. I mean, my God, that sounds a hell of a lot better in some cases than being a software developer. But VCs don't invest in Montana-based guides, probably, right, Seth?
Well, that's true. But I think one of the things that we talk about, right, is like sort of venture capital in Silicon Valley has sort of taken over our view of entrepreneurship. The truth is that only about 1% of all businesses take money from venture capital.
Right.
And most people don't realize that. Now, it's a big pile of money, but most people don't realize that just because of the mind share that venture takes up. And frankly, and I can say this as a 20-year venture capitalist, it's not the greatest model, right? 75% of venture funds don't even return money as a fund. 66% of each investment, each round, fails to return the money that was invested in that round. So it's not necessarily a great mechanism for channeling money to successful businesses. What it does is it picks a very small number of successful businesses, right? And so we don't talk about this in the book actually, but I've been using this language as we've done more kind of post-writing follow-ups. But Silicon Valley is obsessed with what we call unicorns, right?
Right.
Businesses that are valued at greater than $1 billion, with the idea that if it's worth $1 billion, someone's making money somewhere because they invested at a lower amount. That's great, but what we don't realize is that there's a relatively small number of unicorns, certainly relative to the number of businesses that get funded. What we like to talk about are camels, which is a term I stole from one of my favorite entrepreneurs, a guy who's doing work in Africa called named Fred Swaniker. And camels they're less sexy. But they're also not mythical, right? They actually exist. And they're like the workhorses, right? I mean, they're hardy. They're a little bit slower. What we need is not a small number in America to keep our economy stable. We need not just a small number of unicorns. We need a large number of camels. And I think that's what we sort of get excited about, which is that most people, to your point, are working on a restaurant or a hair salon. They're working on businesses that are camel businesses. They are the bedrock of their communities. They are making money, hopefully from day one. They're employing people, by the way, employing people in huge numbers. 40% of the US workforce work for small businesses that are categorized as small business. Those businesses generate nearly 50% of the GDP of the US economy. These are critically important companies to our financial infrastructure and to our economy, but we kind of overlook them because it's sexier to talk about these, these high-flying unicorns, by the way, who kind of thrive in part, and they're profitable in part because they don't employ a lot of people. They're using technology and leveraging that so they don't have to employ so many folks. So that's kind of how we see the world. And of course, the book is full of stories about people who are building the chefs. The story that Elizabeth just relayed, is one of the I think the most powerful stories in the book, but the book is full of stories like that. And interesting, as you said, I mean, who wouldn't want to be a guide in the wilderness in Montana? But we actually start by telling that story. We start by talking about how Claire Chef, who's the mother in the family, was uncomfortable with some of her her position relative to some of her peers. She went to an Ivy League school, and she felt like somehow her life hadn't lived up to expectations. And we talk about sort of this realization that she comes to over the course of a couple of years that no, the work she's doing is really important, and she's providing a great life for her family, and also helping create environmentalists by bringing people out into the wilderness. And so I think it's important to recognize that the path that some of these entrepreneurs choose can be hard, and we make it harder by always comparing them to these high-flying Silicon Valley companies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I like that story in particular because I think it points to the experiential economy, which maybe we can talk about a little bit more in terms of, I think once we come out of the pandemic, where lots of folks are talking about roaring 20s, number 2 or whatever, where I think a lot of us are sick of being on Zoom, sick of being stuck inside, and boy, the travel industry is going to explode, hopefully, and things like that. But let's look back though in time, because you guys have a lot of amazing stuff from America's history and the ways in which particularly women and people of color have almost been forgotten. And these are people who owned small businesses in the past, and they're just not talked about in the history books as much. Can you really discuss that for a couple of moments?
Sure. So shall we continue? I'll go first and then Seth will go.
Sure.
It's a working pattern, so we'll stick with it. Let's see. So, first of all, I think entrepreneurship has not been fully studied as a part of American history and as a part of the core identity of the country. When we set out to do the research, we looked around for a book. Like, we thought we'd write like a 1-page paragraph, summary of entrepreneurship in American history based on some great book written by some huge professor. And we didn't
Malcolm Gladwell or something.
Right.
Yeah.
We didn't find that at all. So then we thought, well, we'll just write our own chapter, which is the very first chapter we wrote. And Seth, I think, authored most of that one. And then I went in and kind of wove around it. Writing with Seth was like an incredible experience, by the way. So what we discovered was not only entrepreneurship was not really woven into the identity of America in a recognized way. And part of that is because we'd forgotten so many of the entrepreneurs themselves. Like women entrepreneurs, for instance, were getting patents at a much higher rate than men. Around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So there were tons of American women entrepreneurs who really played a role in commercializing inventions like the ironing board, or like, I don't know, maybe Seth will remember another one, but there are...
Well, computer algorithm, right? I mean, we think some of them, we think a lot of them as, sort of relating to the home, and that's true, but yeah, the first computer algorithm was written by a woman, for example. So there are lots of contributions, but they seem to have been forgotten.
Yeah, and then discovering how many African American entrepreneurs there were, and it's tricky to write about them, right? Because they're sort of like ghosts in our history, not really recorded. So you have to see the shape of their contribution and their presence in kind of the negative, right? And meaning like in a photography where you're looking at the reverse of what the visual part is easy to see, but there's so much that happens off the screen. And so when we did that history, we really had to look at that, and also look at the ways that that finance really shaped so much of the entrepreneurial communities in the early days of America, which I think led us to the conclusion that finance can again be reinvented to shape the future.
Oh, I love that. And, we see that ironically happening in other countries. Africa, for example, with mobile payments has been a leader in that for quite some time, well ahead of the US, I would say, right? Seth, you probably have more experience with this. I've also worked with a company in the UK, and their mobile payment structure is a lot better than it is in the US, uh, ironically. So I think we have a lot of catching up to do.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I think even more broadly, just as Elizabeth kind of referenced, that the way that we finance companies is still sort of stuck from 50 years ago, right? And I talked about 1% of businesses taking money from venture capitalists. Only about 17% of businesses take bank loans. So there's this huge middle that's over 80% of businesses that
Yeah.
don't have any formalized way of accessing capital. So they tend to access it either through just friends and family, right? You call up your aunt or your uncle and they invest a little bit in your restaurant. Or a lot of entrepreneurs take money out of their homes. So they're leveraging home equity lines.
Yeah.
That's not really sustainable. In general, it's definitely not sustainable because of some of the systemic practices that have led to a huge gap in wealth between white and Black and Hispanic families in our country. 400 years of systemic racism have led to a 10x difference in wealth between the average white family and the average Black family, 7x between the average white family and the average Hispanic family. And that, by the way, that is true if you normalize for income level. That's true if you normalize for education level. It is the product of a history that didn't allow people of color in the United States to build generational wealth at the rate that white families were able to. And then you add to that now that more and more people starting businesses are Black, brown, and female. And those wealth gaps become really significant impediments to people starting businesses because again, over 80% of businesses don't receive any formalized capital. Now, we should change that, and we talk about that in the book. We need to extend the banking system and other forms of finance. We talk about some new and novel ideas around that to allow for more of this 80% of businesses that are unfunded to access some sort of formalized capital. And there are ways to do that I think make a lot of sense. Some of which are private and involve sort of more direct capital investment, some of which might be either supported by or have the government play a direct investment role as well. So we talk about, we have a whole chapter in the book about ideas around how to fix that finance system. But really, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, one of the key themes of the book is this disconnect between the people starting businesses now and our systems of finance. And our systems of finance are still controlled by people who look a lot like me and you, right? White guys.
Yeah.
And they just really haven't changed or adapted. That system is pretty good at funneling money to a very small number of businesses, more businesses that are run by white guys, right? And if you look at venture capital, we're sort of the poster child for that, right? 6% of companies that receive venture dollars are run by women. Fewer than 1% are run by Black people. So it's just really not an effective way, has not been an effective way of channeling money to a broader sector of the economy. But there are opportunities to change that in venture, but that'll affect that 1% slice. And there are lots of opportunities to change that for the rest of our economy.
Can you talk about one or two of the ways maybe that come to mind for those folks that, don't have the wealth built up from generations and they're just completely bootstrapping a new business and don't have access to bank loan? I mean, even I know it's, as a small business owner, it's hard to go to the bank and get a loan. It's been that way for years, probably since 2008. That really shuttered a lot of free lending practices for many good reasons. But it used to be, before that, as a small business, you could go to the bank and get a line of credit or whatever. And now unless you have a good line of credit with the VISA corporation, with your credit card or whatever, then you're screwed. So are there some other ways though, Seth and Elizabeth, that people can tap into now to help kickstart things? Other than a pandemic that, throws out tons of SBA loans and things, low cost interest loans.
Yeah. Well, one of the communities that we cover in the book is Stanton, Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
which I like because there are a lot of examples in Stanton, Virginia of alternative kinds of financing, and they were developed kind of holistically by the community pulling together. For instance, they have an angel fund, which doesn't just invest in tech founders. So it's like fairly wealthy people from the community who set up an angel pitching night, and anybody can come in, and it can be like your local t-shirt maker who's 19, pitch to them. But it could also be, there's a local, I think, a pie maker that got money from that
Oh,
angel.
we all need more pie shops for
I
crying out
know,
loud,
right?
right?
They're supposed to be really good too, although I did not have one when I was there. But it also has a community loan fund, which is a model that we found really promising, and found a number of examples across the country that have been quietly doing this good work for decades, but could use new policies from Washington to help spur their growth and probably more highlight their role and get more funding to them. But I do think there are opportunities for small businesses to seek finance from those places. At the same time, I think there are not nearly enough of those places, and they don't have nearly the kind of funds that they need to provide support to small business. And so one of the things we're really out beating the drum about right now is the idea that we need to look at rebuilding our financial infrastructure. And that includes community banks. It includes really taking a hard look at regulations in Washington that maybe pulled back too hard on the free lending practices after 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, hearing from small business owners like you kind of just builds that case more, right? That if a small business can't get a loan, okay, that's a big problem, right? Finance is the key to growth. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what are some other things that you guys looked into that we can put into place to help turn the decline in entrepreneurship in America?
Well, we have a couple ideas that we talk about in the book. I'll start with something that's relatively simple, and I don't mean to be sort of Pollyanna as I say it, but one of the first things we talk about is just recognizing and valuing new builders, right? And I guess a part of that is shop local and that sort of thing. And that's important, but I don't mean it in sort of a glib sense. Like, I really mean when you walk into a shop and there's someone behind the register, that person may likely be the business owner, which means they probably are doing the inventory and doing the merchandising. And at night they're doing the bookkeeping, right? And then there they are, at the counter, like treating them more kindly.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good start. If you work for a bigger business, there's an opportunity to pay your smaller vendors faster. That actually makes a huge difference.
Yes.
And I think a lot of big businesses have the opposite view, where they feel like, oh, well, these small vendors, they can't, I can take advantage of them, so I'm gonna give them 120-day payment terms. Why don't we reverse that thinking? Like, why not give them? You're going to pay them the money. Why not give them 20-day payment terms or 5-day payment terms, right? And that makes a huge impact on a small business. Going into the pandemic, we know that the average small business had between 2 and 4 weeks of working capital on their balance sheet. So paying them earlier if you're a bigger vendor, or allowing them better payment terms if you're a bigger vendor and they're buying from you, those are really significant things that people can do who are maybe listening to this podcast that work for larger businesses. So those are some things that we can do. Obviously, we need to lobby the powers that be to free up more capital. We talk about financial infrastructure. We talk about a bunch of ideas around this, but we cover in the book a number of really innovative public-private partnerships, community loan funds that are very effective ways at getting money into smaller businesses that might not qualify for bank loans. In fact, many of these community loan funds specialize in businesses that were already turned down by banks, but yet their default rates are significantly lower than bank default rates because they actually work with businesses and provide what's called technical services, basically support services to those businesses. We talk about the community loan fund in New Hampshire, for example, that's doing that. We talk about a couple of others, providing more money that could just be matching money. So it matches local money. That's the case in the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. But providing more money and more capital would be really helpful for that. Elizabeth touched on the community banking system, which needs to be bolstered. We have actually lost a significant portion of our banks
Yes.
due to consolidation. We had 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, there were some 10,000 plus banks in the United States. Today, there are 4,800. That consolidation has happened because Dodd-Frank, which instituted some reasonable controls in many cases on predatory lending practices, went too far and really kind of hampered these smaller banks. Many of those small banks had nothing to do with the financial crisis that Dodd-Frank was responding to. So easing those regulations, finding ways to kind of reverse that trend for small banks. We talk about the community finance development institution sector of the community banking world, the CDFI world, and how important that is. Again, these are institutions that are supported by the CDFI fund by the federal government, which is much too small and needs to be increased. They do a much, much better job at funneling money to founders that are Black, brown, and female, and that have trouble getting loans from these what have become de facto utilities, these huge banks. I think a lot of people also don't realize 80% of U.S. deposits, so a huge portion of U.S. capital, is controlled by just 4 large banks now because of all of this consolidation. And that trend is dangerous, right? I mean, there's some economies to scale that probably are beneficial on the margin, but it's just too much control by too few number of companies. And because it's created these sort of de facto utilities, lending has become much more algorithmic. There's not the chance for you as a small business owner to have a relationship with a community banker to go in and explain your story and get a loan based on that relationship. And we talk in a number of places in the book about some of the new builders that whose stories that we discuss, how they were helped by a community banker, right, who realized the power of what they were doing, believed in their vision, and took a chance on them. And we lose that when banking becomes algorithmic. And by the way, we know the algorithms are racially biased, so that's been studied and proven. So there are all sorts of problems by, again, turning our banking system into a de facto utility. We should be moving in the other direction.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys touch on so many amazing topics in the book. As we wrap up, and we could keep talking about this stuff for hours, but can you give us just a couple of the key takeaways that you hope readers will get out of the New Builders?
Well, the first one is definitely recognizing the changing face of entrepreneurship. And that is key to renewing it. So recognizing who the new builders are today, that they're women and people of color, and that we need to support them if we're going to renew the decline of entrepreneurship in the United States.
I love that.
And I would add to that. I would add to that optimism. I think we left. We write about this in the sort of final part of the book. We kind of checked in as we were writing the book over the last probably 9 months or so. We wrote it pretty quickly because when the pandemic hit, we realized we'd done the research pre-pandemic and we realized, wow, this story needs to get out very, very quickly. But at the very end of that, and so we were obviously checking in and seeing how people were doing because the pandemic became part of the story and we needed to include it. But right before we kind of finished the copy, which was probably February, maybe January this year, 2021, we checked in with a lot of the new builders that we had talked to, and they're a very gritty, optimistic group. And I think our key takeaway at the end of all of this research and writing was that we're very optimistic. There are troubling trends, and we need to recognize those trends, and we need to come together as a country and decide that we want to do something about that. But ultimately, we were left feeling very hopeful about the future of the American economy, the future of the American entrepreneur, because we realized that these new builders are incredibly gritty and incredibly persevering. And that left us feeling very hopeful and optimistic.
That's excellent, because I think there can be tons of pessimism. When you look around and you see Amazon taking over everything and you think, gosh, I can't compete with that if I want to start some small retail shop in my town or whatever. Well, maybe you can, because I think people are going to be looking for those bespoke experiences and the relationship building that you said, and if you own a pie shop, for crying out loud, that you can't scale that but so far, and then it starts to taste like cafeteria food. So you want to go to the small local pie shop, because I just did that the other weekend. Got an amazing pie at a local small pie shop real close to our house. Anyway, it's just fascinating reading, and both for the history and for where things are headed. So where can people get a copy of The New Builders from you guys?
Well, we have a website, which is just www.thenewbuilders.com. And you can buy it there from a host of different bookstores. We have some independent bookstores, Barnes and Noble and Amazon. So take your pick of where to order it. And we hope a lot of people do.
Definitely. Well, thank you guys, Elizabeth and Seth, for writing the book and getting it out. It can't come at a better time.
Thank you so much for having us on. And I hope you enjoyed
Thank
the
you.
pie. That sounds really awesome, actually.
Thanks, Brandon. We appreciate it.